Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hello. What's up, guys? Okay. Next episode, right back into it. Battle of Hastings was last episode, so now the real history of England begins. Let's do it. If you're new to the channel, my name's Connor. Hello. All the things, hit all the buttons, just do it. Okay, let's go. Right into it.
Family. This new 1086 and England has a new king and a new royal family. This new king was William, better known as William the Conqueror, and he was now indisputably in charge. The next year he died, which caused problems, mostly for William due to the whole being dead thing, but also because of the succession. Norman inheritance law was complicated, but essentially the father would give to the eldest son what he himself had inherited, and whatever he had gained in life he could distribute however he saw fit. William's eldest son was Robert, who under this law gained Normandy. William's second eldest son was also called William, and he inherited England, becoming William II, but he is better known as William Rufus. Henry, William's third son, just got a wad of cash and no land. So being king is objectively better than being a duke, and so unsurprisingly Robert was none too happy with his younger brother now being his superior. So at first both Robert and William agreed to be each other's heirs, but this agreement broke down in 1088. This was when Robert, with the help of his barons, attempted to overthrow William so that he could be king. The Norman barons were faced with the issue of owning lands in both Normandy and England. This meant that if the brothers came to blows, the nobles would certainly have had their lands confiscated in one place or the other. The barons wanted England and Normandy to be united politically so that it was easier for them to concentrate on the external threats to their holdings, which at this point were the King of France and the Duke of Anjou. The disagreement between the brothers is known as the Baronial Rebellion of 1088 due to the number of nobles that picked Robert over William. It included widespread raiding across southern England, but the king eventually won out by coercing some lords to rejoin him and by capturing the leader of the revolt, Otto, who was banished thereafter. During this rebellion, it included widespread raiding across southern England, but the king eventually won out by coercing some lords to rejoin him and by capturing the leader of the revolt, Otto, who was banished thereafter. During this rebellion against him, William Rufus had to deal with an invasion from the Scottish king Malcolm III. William was busy fighting in Normandy and so had to return to England, but Malcolm quickly signed a treaty before any real retaliation could happen. The relationship between England and Scotland during this period was complicated and can essentially be summed up as an uneasy stalemate. Scotland lacked the manpower to conquer England, and Scotland's terrain made it too expensive for an English army to hold, and thus the stalemate would continue. William and Malcolm ended up coming to blows again in 1091, when Malcolm invaded England but was quickly stopped, and after this the kingdoms entered a period of prolonged peace and mutual love. Or perhaps not.
Okay.
Since in 1093 the kingdoms entered a period of prolonged peace and mutual love. Or perhaps not, since in 1093 the Scottish ravaged the lands of Northumbria. The Earl of Northumbria, presumably annoyed at his lands being destroyed, ambushed King Malcolm later the same year here at a place called Alnwick. The ambush saw King Malcolm and his son and heir Edward killed, thus ending the war and plunging Scotland into a dynastic crisis. William's issues with his brother were ended in 1095 not by a military victory but by a stroke of luck when Pope Urban II began to preach for a crusade to retake the holy city of Jerusalem. Duke Robert now had an easy way out, which could potentially win him his own lands as well as some glory. Robert thus leased Normandy to William in order to finance his part in the First Crusade. This fortunate timing by the church ended one of William's disputes, but another was still raging, that of his relationship with the church and specifically Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anselm believed that the church did not answer to the king but to God through the Pope. This belief that churchmen owed no allegiance to any secular power did not sit well with William. Both argued for many years, and in 1097 Anselm was exiled and ended up in Rome. The next 3 years of William's reign were fairly secure and his power remained unchallenged. In 1100, Robert was on his way back from the Crusades, having won glory and also a wealthy wife.
I just wonder, like, let's say that he killed him. What would happen? Like, would a holy army be sent to England? I mean, or like a Christian army, or maybe there'd be unrest in England. I mean, they've been around for... The Archbishop of Canterbury was, what, 600s? So maybe the people just wouldn't like it. I don't know. That just popped in my head. Where's William Wallace, damn it?
Challenged. In 1100, Robert was on his way back from the Crusades, having won glory and also a wealthy wife on the way back, and it seemed that conflict between Robert and William was looming. In the same year, William went hunting with his younger brother Henry, during which he was killed in an arrow-related accident which in no way, shape or form looked suspicious. Before William's body was cold, Henry had seized Winchester, which held the royal treasury, and was soon after coronated as King Henry I. Henry had to move quickly to secure the loyalty of his lords and prevent his returning brother from overthrowing him. On the day of his coronation, Henry issued what is called the Charter of Liberties, in which he essentially repealed the unpopular laws of his brother, such as a noble heir having to pay to claim his inheritance. So this is a good place to explain just how the politics of the nobility worked during the Norman period. The main thing to remember here is that a lord did not own his lands, but instead they were leased from the king in return for their loyal service and payment.
Okay.
These lords could in turn lease these lands to lesser lords, who would lease them in turn to the peasants who worked them. The centrality of land to English life is hard to overstate. To the aristocracy, clergy and the monarchy it was the source of income and authority, but to everyone else, king and peasant alike, it provided everything necessary for medieval life. Its most obvious output was food, and feeding the kingdom required the vast majority of the labour force to be committed to agriculture. Even with this commitment, the amount of food produced was not much over subsistence. Agriculture thus made up the vast majority of England's economy. It had little in the way of raw materials to export, and besides that, the most lucrative of Europe's trade at this time was centred on the Mediterranean. Importantly, the fact that everyday life relied so much on agriculture meant that when there were major crop failures, and there were many, it meant that people simply starved. So back to politics. Robert, having returned to Normandy, gathered some of his nobles and soon after arrived in England, landing in Portsmouth here. Many English nobles, including the powerful Robert of Bouillon, flocked to Duke Robert's side, preparing to overthrow Henry. There was no battle, and instead the brothers agreed that Henry would remain king but had to pay his brother an annual sum. Henry then moved against Bouillon, seizing his lands in England and banishing him. This was done under the pretext of Bouillon's unauthorised conquest of parts of Wales and the building of castles there.
Finally!
The reason for this is that not just any
I know some of you guys answered why, Wales might... It's a mountainous region and maybe they're crazy over there, or it just wasn't worth it. But I always wondered how Wales stuck out for so long without being conquered.
Unauthorised conquest of parts of Wales and the building of castles there. The reason for this is that not just anyone was allowed to build castles, since a rebellious noble could hole up in one and sieges were long and expensive. Soon after this, Duke Robert allied with the exiled Bouillon, and Henry saw this as a betrayal, and in 1105 he invaded Normandy. In 1106,
I gotta
Henry
take a
met
piss,
his
guys. Be right back. Okay, sorry.
brother at the Battle of Tantrambre. In 1105 he invaded Normandy. In 1106, Henry met his brother at the Battle of Tantrambre, which saw Duke Robert captured, after which he would spend the last 28 years of his life in captivity. Henry's reign was not all military. Like his brother, he had some trouble with the church. Anselm, the exiled Archbishop of Canterbury, had returned to England in 1100 and had importantly supported Henry's claim over his older brothers.
What? Hold on, sorry.
Captured, after which he would spend the last 28 years of his brother at the Battle of Tantrambre, which saw Duke Robert captured, after which he would spend the last 28 years of his life in captivity. Henry's reign was not all military. Like his brother, he had some trouble with the church. Anselm, the exiled Archbishop of Canterbury, had returned to England in 1100 and had importantly supported Henry's claim over his older brothers. This did not mean that the two were good friends or anything, since having spent a couple of years in Rome, Anselm had become acquainted with the official church policy on the appointment of bishops. The position of the Pope was that only he could appoint bishops, since kings were simply lay people concerned with lesser earthly things, and that the popes were concerned with greater heavenly issues. Unsurprisingly, this did not please Henry, since appointing people to important church positions was an important way of making allies. There was some bickering between the two.
Okay, so Henry VIII was not the first to dislike the Pope and his authority in England.
Officially agreeing to the demands, his say-so was still very important in deciding who would be appointed. It was only a technical concession, but importantly, Henry had agreed that he was a member of the laity and that the Pope was above him in authority. So back to politics, and Henry, having imprisoned his brother, was now also the Duke of Normandy, meaning that the main threats to his power were external. The two major threats were Louis VI, the King of France, and Fulk V, the Duke of Anjou. The former Duke Robert had a son, William, who felt that Normandy was rightfully his, and he sought the help of the other lords to retake his birthright.
So what is the deal with Anjou?
The King of France, and Fulk V, the Duke of Anjou.
I'll learn about that later, I suppose. Did I miss something with that?
The former Duke Robert had a son, William, who felt that Normandy was rightfully his, and he sought the help of the other lords to retake his birthright. In 1118, with the help of the Count of Flanders, he led a rebellion in Normandy, which saw most of the duchy fall, but it dissipated quickly after the Count of Flanders was injured in a siege. In the next year, Louis VI of France invaded, but Henry led an army against him, and the French were defeated at the Battle of Bremule. To finance this war, immense taxes were raised, including the continuation of the Danegeld established under the previous Anglo-Saxon monarchs. Henry was notable for being good with the kingdom's finances, the evaluation of which was done with a checkered piece of cloth called the exchequer. By the way, this is why the modern minister in charge of the economy is
really
checkered. Henry was notable for being good with the kingdom's finances, the evaluation of which was done with a checkered piece of cloth called the exchequer. By the way, this is why the modern minister in charge of the economy is called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Henry had just managed to avoid catastrophe in losing Normandy, but his reign was made much more complicated when his son, William, drowned in the English Channel after his ship sank. This left Henry with no legitimate male heirs, only a daughter, Matilda. In 1125, Matilda was left widowed after her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor, died and returned to England, where King Henry appointed her as his heir. Matilda is often referred to as Empress during this period, but after her husband died, she no longer held the title. Henry married her to the son of Count Fulk of Anjou, a man called Geoffrey Plantagenet. Henry soon after fell out with Geoffrey and Matilda, which meant that upon Henry's death in 1135, a succession crisis would break out. So there were two potential heirs for the English throne. The first was of course Geoffrey, who at the time of Henry's death was in Anjou. The other was Henry's nephew, Stephen, the Count of Boulogne. Given Henry's arguments with Geoffrey and Matilda, the English nobles weren't too keen on them, whereas Stephen was very popular. Fortunately for Stephen, he was much closer to England than his rivals, meaning he could act first, which he did. He soon after arrived in London and secured the support of the major lords, and on December the 22nd he was crowned King of England and made Duke of Normandy. Major problems didn't begin for Stephen until 1138, when Robert, the Earl of Gloucester, revolted against him, declaring for Matilda. To make matters worse, Geoffrey, who was now the Count of Anjou since his father had left to become King of Jerusalem. Major problems didn't begin for Stephen until 1138, when Robert, the Earl of Gloucester, revolted against him, declaring for Matilda. To make matters worse, Geoffrey, who was now the Count of Anjou since his father had left to become King of Jerusalem, invaded Normandy. At the same time in the north, King David I of Scotland invaded and annexed Carlisle. This period of English history is often referred to as the Anarchy, but in many respects it was more a routine war of succession. There were rebelling lords in areas which English authority was shattered, but ultimately it was no more anarchic than any other civil war previous to this. During the anarchy, Stephen made several errors. The first was allowing Matilda to slip through his grasp after she landed at Arundel here, and met with Earl Robert of Gloucester in Bristol in 1139. His next mistake was at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, in which instead of retreating when the battle was going against him, Stephen continued to fight and ended up getting himself captured and imprisoned. This should have been the end of the Civil War and Stephen's reign, but that would have required the other side to not make mistakes also, which they did. Matilda entered London and swiftly offended everyone there, and was chased out shortly before her planned coronation. Soon after that, Earl Robert was captured and Matilda agreed to swap prisoners, Robert for Stephen, which meant the Civil War would continue. Geoffrey conquered Normandy in 1144, whereas in England no headway was made in the Civil War until Earl Robert died in 1147, and Matilda, realising it was over, left the year afterwards. In 1150, Geoffrey made he and Matilda's son, Henry, the Duke of Normandy, and Geoffrey himself died a year later, meaning Henry also became the Count of Anjou as well. In 1152, King Louis VII divorced his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who roughly 11 seconds later married Henry, giving him Aquitaine as well and control of all of this territory. In a daring act, Henry sailed to England to negotiate the succession. Stephen's heir had died, so it was agreed that Stephen would remain king.
So
but Henry
England actually possessed land in France, all the way down to the modern border of Spain. Even looks like a little bit into Spain. That's crazy. I did not know that.
Control of all of this territory. In a daring act, Henry sailed to England to negotiate the succession. Stephen's heir had died, so it was agreed that Stephen would remain king, but Henry would succeed him. Thus peace was finally secured in England. Henry wouldn't have to wait long, since Stephen would die in 1154 and Henry would succeed him as Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet dynasty and the man who ruled over all of this land. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some book recommendations in the description.
Thank you for making. More. All right, awesome video. I'm ready for the next one. Coming out soon. I don't know why exactly I chose this. But... All right, what is the next one, by the way? Is that William Wallace time?
1154.
Maybe after that. All right. Be back with another one soon. Hope you guys are doing well. If not, that sucks. You'll be good soon. Don't worry. See you next time.